Boston, Massachusetts. February 14th, 1847. Margaret Whitmore woke to silence. Not the ordinary quiet of early morning, but something deeper. An absence that pressed against her ears like water. Outside her window, Beacon Hill lay buried under fresh snow that had erased the usual sounds of carriage wheels and street vendors. Inside the mansion, even the servants moved as though afraid to disturb whatever had settled over the house during the night. She was 8 years old today? No, not today. That had been last month. Today was Valentine's Day, which her mother said was about love, but felt more like another occasion for uncomfortable dresses and forced politeness. The cherubs on her ceiling stared down with their permanent smiles. Her father had commissioned them when she was born, wanting his only daughter to sleep beneath symbols of innocence. Margaret had counted them once. 47 cherubs, each with blank eyes that seemed to follow her movements. She'd stopped counting after that. Something had pulled her from sleep, though she couldn't say what. A sound that wasn't quite a sound. A presence that wasn't quite there. The feeling of being watched by something other than painted angels. Mrs. Brennan arrived at 7:15, as always. The Irish nursemaid moved through the morning routine with mechanical precision. Curtains opened, fire stoked. The day's dress laid out with reverent care. Today's selection was particularly elaborate. Pink silk and white lace that Margaret's mother had ordered weeks ago. The dress hung like a confection, beautiful and utterly impractical. Margaret submitted to being dressed without complaint. Resistance required energy she didn't have, and Mrs. Brennan's fingers worked too quickly to avoid anyway. Petticoats, stockings, the dress itself. Each layer added weight and restriction until Margaret felt less like a child and more like a doll being prepared for display. The Whitmore breakfast was formal and silent. Her father hid behind his newspaper at one end of the table. Her mother studied correspondence at the other. Margaret occupied her assigned seat in between, eating eggs she couldn't taste while household staff moved like ghosts around the periphery. The knock came as servants cleared the dishes. Sharp. Urgent. Wrong somehow, though Margaret couldn't explain why a knock should feel wrong. Hastings, the butler, moved to answer it, his footsteps precise on the marble floor. Voices murmured in the foyer, his calm and measured, another young and nervous. When Hastings returned, he carried a box, large, wrapped in cream-colored paper, tied with crimson ribbon that gleamed like fresh blood in the morning light. Her name flowed across the surface in script so perfect, it seemed printed rather than written. Her mother's face changed when she saw it. A subtle tightening around the eyes, a pause before reaching for the package. Her father lowered his newspaper, merchant instincts alert to anything unexpected. Hastings explained in his careful butler's voice, a boy had delivered it, paid by a woman in a dark cloak. No name given. The boy had vanished into the morning crowds before questions could be asked. Margaret felt her heart beat faster, though she couldn't say why. It was just a box, just a gift, just a Valentine's Day present like the cards and sweets other children received. But her mother's hands trembled slightly as she cut the ribbons. The outer paper fell away to reveal polished wood beneath, cherry, gleaming like dark honey, brass hinges, a heart-shaped clasp. And carved into the lid in that same perfect script, M-E-W. Her mother opened it. White silk unfolded in layers like petals, and nested in the center, perfect as a jewel, lay the doll. Margaret's breath stopped. She had owned dolls before, cloth dolls, wooden dolls, simple porcelain dolls with painted faces and yarn hair. But this was something different. Something that existed in the uncanny space between toy and art, between craft and creation. 18 inches of flawless porcelain. Glass eyes the color of summer sky. Real hair, golden and curled, arranged with a hairdresser's precision. Tiny teeth visible between parted lips. A blush on the cheeks that looked like blood beneath skin rather than paint on porcelain. The dress alone was a masterpiece. Silk and lace, constructed with techniques used for adult garments, not children's toys. Seed pearl buttons down the back, miniature gloves, delicate slippers. Every detail obsessively perfect, and embroidered on the chest. A red heart containing her initials in golden thread, MEW. A card lay beneath, hand-painted roses and cherubs. Inside, that flowing script. For Margaret, a companion to cherish on this Valentine's Day and all the days to follow. May she bring you joy and keep you safe from the sorrows that await in the world beyond childhood. With devoted affection, your eternal friend. No signature, just those 3 words, your eternal friend. The phrase slithered through Margaret's mind like something alive. Eternal suggested permanence, endlessness, something that wouldn't leave or couldn't be escaped. Friend suggested intimacy, knowledge, a relationship that didn't exist with anyone she knew. Her mother wanted to refuse it. Margaret could see the desire in her face, the maternal instinct to protect warring with social convention. One didn't simply discard expensive gifts, especially not without knowing who sent them or why. Her father applied merchant's logic, probably from a family friend, perhaps a business associate, someone modest who preferred anonymity. The explanation sounded reasonable when he said it, though Margaret noticed her mother's expression didn't change. Margaret lifted the doll from its silk nest, cold, heavy, smooth as ice. The glass eyes caught the light and for a moment, just a moment, seemed to focus on her face with something like recognition. The doll smelled wrong. Roses, yes, but underneath something medicinal and sharp. Something that made Margaret think of the sick room where her grandmother had died 2 years ago. Something that belonged to endings, not beginnings. She named it Valentine because she couldn't think of anything else. The household staff offered polite admiration when she showed them. Mrs. Brennan's response was different. A slight stiffening, a look that Margaret had seen before when the nursemaid encountered things that violated her Irish sensibilities. But she said nothing, knowing her opinion on such matters carried no weight. That first night, Mrs. Brennan placed the doll on a chair near Margaret's bed, positioning it carefully so the glass eyes faced the wall rather than the sleeping child. Margaret noticed but didn't ask why. Some knowledge felt safer left unspoken. Sleep came slowly. When it came, it brought dreams. 4 girls, all her age, all dressed in elaborate gowns. They stood in a circle around her, mouths moving urgently, hands reaching. Behind them, barely visible, a tall figure in a dark cloak watched with infinite patience. The girls were trying to warn her. Margaret understood that much, but their voices made no sound, their words had no meaning, and when she reached back toward their outstretched hands, her fingers passed through them like smoke. She woke before dawn with her heart racing. Valentine stood at the foot of her bed, not sitting, not lying, standing upright on porcelain feet, glass eyes fixed on Margaret's face with an intensity that froze her breath in her throat. Mrs. Brennan must have moved it during the night, must have come to check on her and repositioned it without thinking. The explanation was logical and completely unconvincing. Margaret climbed from bed on trembling legs and returned the doll to the chair, placing it exactly as she remembered from bedtime. The porcelain felt colder than before, as if it had absorbed the February night rather than being protected from it. When Mrs. Brennan arrived that morning, Margaret mentioned finding the doll moved. The nursemaid's face changed, not surprise exactly, but confirmation of something she'd already suspected. She questioned Margaret closely in hushed tones that created more fear than speaking openly would have. Then she made the sign of the cross when she thought Margaret wasn't looking. The second night, Mrs. Brennan positioned the doll with even greater care, mentally noting its exact placement. She considered removing it from the room entirely, but didn't dare contradict Mrs. Whitmore's instructions. Margaret's dreams intensified. The 4 girls appeared again, more detailed now. She could see their faces clearly. One with dark hair and serious eyes. One with freckles and a gap-toothed smile. One thin and pale as moonlight, one round-cheeked and rosy. They moved their mouths with increasing desperation, and Margaret felt certain that if she could just hear them, just understand what they were trying to say, she would know how to protect herself from whatever was coming. She woke in darkness. Valentine stood beside her bed, not at its foot this time, but inches from her face, close enough that Margaret could see the tiny cracks in the porcelain, the individual painted eyelashes, the almost invisible seam where the glass eyes had been set into the head, close enough to see the lips move. Margaret screamed. Her parents arrived in seconds, her father still buttoning his nightshirt, her mother's hair loose around her shoulders. They found Margaret sitting upright and trembling, pointing at the doll that now lay on the floor beside the bed. A nightmare, they said. An accident. She'd knocked it over in her sleep. These things happened. But Mrs. Brennan, examining the doll's position, knew better. The chair sat 4 feet from the bed, too far for a child's arm to reach, and the doll lay face up with arms stretched above its head in an arrangement too precise to be accidental. She kept these observations to herself and made a decision. Tonight, she would stay awake and watch. The third night revealed what couldn't be explained away. Mrs. Brennan settled into her vigil chair, wrapped in blankets, determined to remain conscious. Margaret fell asleep quickly, exhausted by fear and broken rest. The house settled into silence. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Valentine remained motionless on its chair. The nursemaid's eyes grew heavy despite her determination. She fought sleep, lost, fought again. She jerked awake after midnight, shocked and ashamed. The chair was empty. Panic flooded through her as she scanned the darkened room. Then she saw it at the foot of Margaret's bed, standing upright exactly as the child had described. And she watched, fully awake, fully conscious, as the doll's head turned slowly until its glass eyes fixed directly on her position across the room. Her scream woke the entire household. Chaos followed. Servants and family crowded into the room demanding explanations. Mrs. Brennan could only point and repeat that she'd watched it move, watched it turn, watched something impossible happen in front of her eyes. Her father's patience shattered. He seized the doll, examined it thoroughly, declared it nothing but expertly crafted porcelain that moved when someone touched it, turned when someone repositioned it. He placed it firmly on the chair and forbade further discussion. But her mother looked at Margaret's terrified face and Mrs. Brennan's genuine distress and felt real fear take root. She suggested, carefully, that perhaps the doll should be put away. Her father refused. His pride wouldn't allow retreat from a child's toy. The doll would remain. Mrs. Brennan gave notice that night. 15 years of service ended in tears and whispered apologies. She couldn't stay where evil was welcomed and protected. Her departure sent shock waves through the household and cracked her father's certainty for the first time. Morning brought news that transformed drama into horror. The Harrison family's daughter had fallen mysteriously ill during the night. Eleanor, age 7, had received a porcelain doll the previous week. The family had assumed it came from relatives. Before noon, 2 more reports arrived. Abigail Caldwell, age 9, Catherine Montgomery, age 8. Both ill with symptoms that baffled physicians. Both had received dolls from unknown senders. Both dolls were described as extraordinarily beautiful, dressed in elaborate gowns with the girls' initials embroidered on the bodices. The pattern was too specific for coincidence. Margaret's mother transformed fear into action. She ordered servants to search for information, hired private investigators to trace the deliveries, demanded answers. But it was Margaret who provided the most disturbing evidence when her mother finally asked direct questions about the dreams. 4 girls in elaborate gowns. 4 girls trying to communicate warnings. Margaret drew their faces from memory with a child's limited skill but unmistakable accuracy. Her mother's hands shook as she compared the drawings to newspaper clippings she'd retrieved from the library. 4 girls who had died the previous year, all within weeks of Valentine's Day, all after receiving mysterious gifts that were never explained in the death investigations. The dreams weren't imagination. They were memory. They were warning. They were proof that Margaret was next in a pattern that had already claimed 4 lives. That evening, her parents finally understood the scope of the danger. Her father sent for Dr. Samuel Chen, known for investigating cases other physicians dismissed. He contacted Detective James Morrison, whose reputation for solving impossible cases made him their only hope. But while adults debated and investigated, Valentine remained in Margaret's room, watching with glass eyes that never blinked, counting down days with mechanical patience. And in a workshop hidden within an abandoned orphanage on the outskirts of Boston, Constance Hartwell put finishing touches on 4 new dolls, each crafted with obsessive care, each destined for a specific child, each carrying the same curse. The collection was almost complete. Just one more Valentine's Day, and her daughter would have the eternal sisterhood she deserved. Constance Hartwell had been beautiful once, in the way that certain women are beautiful before grief carves their faces into masks of permanent sorrow. At 32, she possessed the kind of refined features that belonged in portrait galleries. High cheekbones, expressive eyes, elegant posture cultivated through years of governess work in Boston's finest homes. But on the morning of February 14th, 1842, beauty meant nothing. Her daughter was dying, and no amount of elegance or refinement could prevent it. Rose lay in the narrow bed of their rented room above a milliner's shop on Hanover Street, her 8-year-old body burning with scarlet fever. The illness had come suddenly, as it always did. A complaint of throat pain on Monday, fever by Tuesday, the characteristic rash by Wednesday. Now, on Thursday morning, the child's breathing had become labored, each inhalation a struggle that Constance felt in her own chest. The room smelled of vinegar and camphor, remedies that accomplished nothing except mask the sweeter, sickly odor of approaching death. Constance had seen this smell before, in the houses where she'd worked, in the nurseries where wealthy children succumbed to diseases that respected neither money nor social position. But knowing what was coming didn't make it bearable when the dying child was your own. She had sent for Dr. Williamson 3 times. He'd come twice, performed his examinations with professional detachment, and explained that scarlet fever must run its course. Some children recovered, others didn't. Medicine could do little except manage symptoms and hope for the best. His final visit had been yesterday afternoon, and the look he'd given Constance before departing told her everything his professional courtesy wouldn't allow him to say aloud. Rose would not recover. The child stirred, her fever-bright eyes opening to focus on her mother's face. For a moment, clarity returned. That precious, terrible lucidity that sometimes came before the end. The words were barely whispered, so faint that Constance had to lean close to hear them. But she heard. She would remember every syllable for the rest of her life, would replay this moment in her mind 10,000 times, would build an entire architecture of madness on the foundation of her daughter's final coherent sentence. Then Rose's eyes closed, her breathing changed, and within the hour, she was gone. Constance didn't scream, didn't weep, didn't move from the bedside where she held her daughter's cooling hand. The Valentine's Day celebration she'd planned, a small cake, a hand-sewn dress, a morning of stories and songs, lay forgotten on the table across the room. The carefully crafted paper hearts she'd cut from colored paper the night before seemed to mock her from where they hung on ribbons near the window. Love, she thought, staring at those paper hearts. What did love matter when it couldn't prevent death? What good was devotion when it couldn't save the only person who mattered? The funeral was small and cheap, attended by exactly 3 people: Constance, the minister who performed the service, and Mrs. Gilchrist, the milliner who owned the building and who came out of obligation rather than affection. Rose was buried in a pauper's section of the cemetery, marked by a simple wooden cross that wouldn't survive 5 winters. Constance stood at the graveside long after the others had departed, staring at the disturbed earth that covered her daughter's small coffin. Snow began to fall, light flakes that caught in her hair and melted on her cheeks like tears she couldn't shed. She should have felt something: grief, rage, despair, anything. But the place where emotions should have lived had become hollow, a void that echoed with terrible silence. The next morning, she returned to work. The Ashford family had employed her for 3 years as governess to their 2 daughters, Caroline and Elizabeth, ages 7 and 9. The position had been ideal: good wages, respectable household, children who were reasonably well behaved. Constance had managed to maintain the employment even after Rose's birth, though she'd been forced to board her daughter with Mrs. Gilchrist during working hours. Mrs. Ashford expressed sympathy about Rose's death with the careful distance that wealthy women maintained when discussing servants' personal tragedies. She offered Constance 3 days of bereavement leave, which seemed generous until one considered that it took that long to arrange a pauper's funeral. Constance returned on the 4th day and discovered she could no longer bear to look at the Ashford daughters. Caroline and Elizabeth were healthy, well-fed, beautifully dressed children who took their privileges entirely for granted. They complained about lessons, whined about their clothes, demanded expensive toys and elaborate parties. They had everything Rose would never have: security, comfort, futures that stretched ahead filled with possibilities rather than ending abruptly in a rented room above a milliner's shop. The unfairness of it burned in Constance's hollow chest like a coal that wouldn't extinguish. She lasted 6 weeks before giving notice. Mrs. Ashford accepted her resignation with relief, having noticed the strange intensity with which the governess now watched her daughters, the way her hands trembled when braiding their hair, the odd comments she made about preservation and protection. Constance took her accumulated wages and disappeared into Boston's labyrinth of boarding houses and cheap rented rooms. She told no one where she was going, maintained no contact with former employers or acquaintances. The woman who had been Constance Hartwell, respectable governess, ceased to exist. What emerged in her place was something else entirely. The obsession began with a simple observation: dolls lasted longer than children. Constance had always possessed skill with needle and thread, a talent cultivated during her own childhood when she'd been raised by an aunt who ran a dressmaking shop. She'd made simple cloth dolls for Rose, creating small companions from fabric scraps and yarn. But cloth was impermanent, subject to wear and damage and eventual disintegration. Porcelain was different. Porcelain could last centuries, preserving features and expressions with perfect fidelity. A porcelain doll could remain 8 years old forever, never growing up, never changing, never dying. She began studying doll making with the intensity of someone pursuing religious enlightenment. She spent her dwindling wages on books imported from Germany and France, where porcelain doll craftsmanship had reached its highest refinement. She visited workshops and factories, observing techniques and asking questions with such focused determination that master craftsmen found themselves sharing trade secrets they normally guarded carefully. She learned to mix porcelain slip, to pour it into plaster molds, to fire pieces in kilns at precise temperatures. She studied glass eye setting, wig making, the intricate costuming that transformed molded clay into convincing representations of human children. But studying existing techniques wasn't enough. Constance wanted perfection, wanted to create dolls so lifelike that the boundary between representation and reality became permeable, uncertain. She needed a workshop, space where she could work undisturbed and accumulate the tools and materials her craft required. Her remaining money wasn't sufficient to rent proper facilities in Boston, so she looked outside the city, searching for something isolated and cheap. She found it in March 1843, an abandoned orphanage on the outskirts of Boston, accessible by a rutted road that most travelers avoided. The building had housed St. Catherine's Home for Foundling Children until financial difficulties and a diphtheria outbreak forced its closure in 1839. It stood empty now, gradually deteriorating, its broken windows and damaged roof making it unattractive to potential buyers. Constance purchased it for almost nothing, using money she'd saved during her years of employment. The building was structurally sound enough for her purposes, and its isolation meant no neighbors to notice odd hours or unusual activities. She moved in during the first week of April, bringing her few possessions and the growing collection of doll-making materials she'd accumulated. The orphanage was large, 3 floors plus a basement, far more space than she needed. But the building's history appealed to something in her fractured psychology. This had been a place where unwanted children lived and died. Now it would serve a different purpose, one that Constance was only beginning to understand. The first few months were devoted to establishing her workshop. She claimed the largest room on the 2nd floor, positioning her work tables near the windows where natural light was best for detailed painting. She installed a small kiln in the basement, vented through an existing chimney. She organized her tools with obsessive precision, brushes arranged by size, paints sorted by color, molds labeled and cataloged. The building still contained remnants of its previous function: small beds in the dormitories, a few broken toys, children's clothing abandoned in closets. Constance left these items undisturbed, sometimes walking through the empty rooms and imagining the children who had lived here. Orphans who had been unwanted, unclaimed, unloved. Children who had died without families to mourn them, buried in unmarked graves like Rose. The parallel wasn't lost on her. Rose had been functionally an orphan, father unknown or unwilling to acknowledge paternity, mother forced to work long hours just to afford a rented room. If Constance had died first, Rose would have ended up in a place exactly like this, one more unwanted child in an institution's indifferent care. The unfairness of it all crystallized into something hard and sharp in Constance's chest, something that demanded action rather than passive grief. Her first doll was modeled after Rose. She worked from memory and from a single daguerreotype she'd had made when Rose turned 7, a luxury that had consumed a week's wages, but which now served as her only physical reminder of her daughter's face. She studied the image for hours, memorizing every detail: the shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the way Rose's hair fell in soft waves around her face. The process took 3 months of obsessive labor. She mixed and remixed porcelain slip until she achieved exactly the right translucency. She fired and refired pieces until the color matched her memory of Rose's skin. She rejected dozens of glass eyes before finding a pair that captured the precise shade of blue she remembered. The hair was real. Rose's hair, cut from her daughter's head before burial and preserved carefully. Constance washed it in rosewater, brushed it until it gleamed, styled it exactly as she used to style it when Rose was alive. The dress required weeks of work, every stitch perfect, every detail authentic to the clothes Rose had worn. Constance embroidered a small heart on the bodice, adding Rose's initials in golden thread, R.E.H. When she finally completed the doll in July 1843, Constance experienced her first moment of something resembling peace since her daughter's death. The porcelain creation sat propped on her work table, glass eyes reflecting lamplight, delicate features frozen in an expression of innocent contentment. Rose would be 8 years old forever now, safe, preserved, protected from the world that had killed her. Constance named the doll Memory and placed it on a shelf in what had been the orphanage's chapel, a small room with a single stained glass window depicting angels. She visited Memory every day, speaking to it as she had spoken to Rose, telling it stories and singing it songs. But Memory alone wasn't enough. The realization came gradually, building over the months following the first doll's completion. Rose had been lonely in life, isolated by poverty and her mother's work schedule, lacking friends or siblings to share her childhood. Death had made that loneliness permanent and absolute. Unless Constance could give her daughter the companion she'd never had in life. The idea took root with the inevitability of madness disguised as logic. Constance began crafting more dolls, each modeled after girls approximately Rose's age, each given individual features and personalities. She created elaborate backstories for them, imagining the friendships they would form with Rose in whatever spiritual realm existed beyond death. By February 1844, she had completed 6 dolls, each one a masterpiece of her developing skill. She dressed them in coordinating outfits and arranged them in the chapel, creating a tableau of eternal childhood. Rose in the center, surrounded by the friends she'd never had, frozen in a moment that would last forever. But porcelain companions weren't enough. They were representations, symbols, substitutes. What Rose needed, what she deserved, were real friends, real girls who could join her in the perfection of preserved childhood. The thought arrived complete and fully formed, like a message from some dark corner of Constance's fractured mind. If other children died, they could be with Rose. And if those children died before adulthood corrupted them, before the world destroyed their innocence, they would remain pure and perfect forever. She would be doing them a favor, really, protecting them from the suffering that awaited in the years beyond childhood, saving them from the grief and disappointment and betrayal that defined adult existence. And if those children happened to come from wealthy families, families whose daughters had every advantage that Rose had been denied, well, that was simply justice, equity, a rebalancing of cosmic unfairness. The methodology evolved over months of careful planning. Constance studied the wealthy families of Boston, identifying those with daughters in the appropriate age range. She observed their routines, learned their social circles, discovered their vulnerabilities. She realized that direct action was too risky, too likely to result in discovery and arrest. But indirect action, action that appeared natural or coincidental, could be accomplished with minimal risk if executed properly. The dolls would be her instruments, beautiful gifts that wealthy families couldn't refuse, sent anonymously to avoid social complications. The dolls would carry her intentions, embodying the connection between the living girls and Rose's eternal sisterhood. She experimented with various substances that could be incorporated into the dolls without being detected. Herbs with toxic properties, tinctures that caused gradual illness, materials that slowly released harmful compounds. She consulted old books of folk remedies and medieval medicine, finding methods that had been used for centuries to achieve desired effects while maintaining plausible deniability. The hair proved most effective. Constance discovered she could treat real human hair with solutions that would slowly release toxic compounds when in close contact with skin. The process was gradual enough that symptoms appeared over weeks rather than days, mimicking natural illness rather than poisoning. She sourced the hair from various places: wig makers who sold leftovers, barbers who kept cuttings, even funeral homes where the dead were prepared for burial. She treated each lock carefully, soaking it in solutions of her own formulation, drying it in the sun, brushing in additional compounds that would activate when exposed to body heat. The treated hair looked identical to ordinary hair, felt the same, behaved the same. But prolonged contact, the kind that occurred when a child slept with a beloved doll, held it close during the day, brushed its hair and played with it obsessively, would slowly introduce toxins through skin absorption and inhalation. The symptoms would resemble various childhood diseases: fever, weakness, respiratory difficulties, gradual organ failure. Doctors would diagnose scarlet fever or diphtheria or consumption or any of the other illnesses that routinely claimed young lives. No one would suspect the beautiful doll that brought the child comfort in her final days. By February 1845, 3 years after Rose's death, Constance was ready to begin her collection. Her first target was carefully chosen: Amanda Prescott, age 8, daughter of a banker whose wealth had insulated his family from every hardship that ordinary people faced. Amanda had everything: elaborate clothes, expensive toys, a nursery larger than the entire room where Rose had died. She was, by all accounts, a spoiled child who threw tantrums when denied her desires and treated servants with casual cruelty. Constance crafted Amanda's doll with particular care, making it beautiful enough to capture a vain child's obsession. She used hair treated with her most potent formulation, ensuring maximum effectiveness. She dressed it in silk and lace, embroidered Amanda's initials on the bodice, and included a card expressing anonymous admiration. The doll was delivered on Valentine's Day, 1845, left on the Prescott doorstep by a street child, paid a few coins to carry out the task. Constance watched from a distance, hidden in the crowd of mourning pedestrians, and saw the package brought inside. Then she waited. Reports reached her through the network of servants and shopkeepers who shared gossip across social boundaries. Amanda Prescott had received a beautiful doll. Amanda was obsessed with it, carrying it everywhere, sleeping with it, refusing to be separated from it even for a moment. 6 weeks after Valentine's Day, Amanda fell ill. The symptoms appeared gradually: weakness, pale skin, difficulty breathing. Doctors were consulted, remedies attempted, prayers offered. 10 weeks after Valentine's Day, Amanda died. The death was attributed to consumption, that catch-all diagnosis for wasting diseases that physicians couldn't properly identify. The Prescott family grieved with the elaborate rituals that wealthy Bostonians employed to demonstrate their sorrow. Amanda was buried in a fine cemetery with a marble headstone, mourned by parents who would recover eventually and perhaps have more children to replace the one they'd lost. And in the abandoned orphanage outside Boston, Constance Hartwell added Amanda's name to the journal where she recorded her collection. She crafted a new porcelain doll, this one modeled after Amanda's appearance from newspaper accounts and glimpses Constance had caught while observing the family. She placed it in the chapel with Rose and the others, one more friend in the eternal sisterhood. The success of her first collection emboldened her. Over the following year, she targeted 3 more families, sending her beautiful deadly dolls to girls who had committed no crime except being born into privilege, while Rose had been born into poverty. Each death was attributed to natural causes. Each family grieved and recovered. Each lost daughter joined Constance's growing collection in the chapel, preserved in porcelain perfection. By February 1846, Constance had claimed 4 lives and was planning 4 more for the upcoming Valentine's Day. Her technique had been refined through experience, her methods perfected, her confidence absolute. She had also descended completely into madness, though she no longer recognized it as such. In her fractured understanding, she was performing a sacred service, rescuing innocent children from the corruption of adulthood, reuniting them with Rose in a realm of eternal childhood, correcting the cosmic unfairness that had taken her daughter while allowing others to live. The journal she kept became increasingly elaborate, no longer a simple record but a manifesto explaining her divine mission. She wrote lengthy entries about each collected girl, describing their personalities, their final days, their spiritual transition to Rose's sisterhood. She created elaborate charts showing relationships between the girls, imagining conversations and friendships that existed only in her delusion. The chapel became a shrine filled with candles and flowers, the porcelain dolls arranged as if engaged in eternal play. Constance spent hours there, speaking to Rose's doll, describing the new friends she was bringing, planning future additions to the collection. She had expanded her targets beyond Boston, identifying wealthy families in other Massachusetts towns and even in neighboring states. Her vision had grown to encompass dozens of girls, all preserved at the perfect age, all part of Rose's eternal Valentine sisterhood. The 1846 collection proceeded exactly as planned. 4 dolls delivered on Valentine's Day. 4 girls gradually sickened over the following weeks. 4 deaths attributed to various childhood diseases. 4 new additions to the chapel shrine. Constance felt genuine joy for the first time since Rose's death, certain that her daughter was no longer lonely, that the cosmic unfairness had been partially corrected, that her mission was righteous and necessary. By February 1847, she was preparing her most ambitious collection yet. Not just 4 dolls, but 8, doubling her previous efforts. She had identified the targets carefully, daughters of Boston's wealthiest families, girls who exemplified the privilege and security that Rose had been denied. Margaret Whitmore was among them, though not the primary target. That designation belonged to Eleanor Harrison, whose father's shipping fortune represented exactly the kind of excessive wealth that Constance had come to despise. But Margaret's family was wealthy enough, their daughter healthy and happy enough, to deserve inclusion in the collection. Constance crafted each doll with obsessive attention to detail, treating the hair with her most refined toxic formulations, creating costumes of exceptional beauty, writing cards that expressed the devoted affection she genuinely felt toward the children she was murdering. She had become efficient at the delivery process, employing street children to carry packages to various addresses on Valentine's Day morning, paying them enough to ensure cooperation, but not enough to make the task memorable. She watched from distances as her beautiful deadly gifts were accepted into homes where they would slowly claim their victims. Everything was proceeding perfectly. Within weeks, 8 more girls would join Rose's eternal sisterhood. By year's end, Constance planned to have collected 20 girls, a round number that seemed appropriate for the completion of the first phase of her mission. What she didn't anticipate was Catherine Patterson's survival, or the investigation that would follow, or the disruption of plans that had proceeded flawlessly for 3 years. But that knowledge lay in the future. On Valentine's Day, 1847, as Constance arranged fresh flowers around the chapel shrine and spoke to Rose's doll about the new friends who would soon arrive, she felt only satisfaction and righteous purpose. The collection would continue, the sisterhood would grow, and Rose would never be lonely again. In the darkened chapel of the abandoned orphanage, surrounded by porcelain representations of murdered children, Constance Hartwell smiled and began planning her next Valentine's Day collection. Dr. Samuel Chen had seen many things during his 15 years of medical practice in Boston that defied conventional explanation. Illnesses that appeared and vanished without cause. Recoveries that violated every principle of medical science. Deaths that occurred despite every indication the patient should survive. He had learned early in his career that admitting ignorance was often wiser than pretending certainty, and that the boundaries between medicine, superstition, and genuine mystery were more permeable than most physicians cared to acknowledge. But the case of the Valentine dolls tested even his considerable tolerance for the inexplicable. He sat in the Whitmore drawing room on the evening of February 20th, reviewing notes he'd compiled over the past 3 days of intensive investigation. Around him, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Thomas Whitmore paced near the windows, his merchant's composure fractured by fear for his daughter. Caroline sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Margaret herself was upstairs, sleeping fitfully under Mrs. Brennan's temporary replacement, a stern woman from an employment agency who had been given strict instructions never to leave the child alone. Detective James Morrison occupied the chair opposite Dr. Chen, his notebook open to pages covered in precise handwriting. Morrison was younger than Chen by a decade, but his reputation for solving difficult cases had made him Boston's most sought-after investigator. His face bore the kind of sharp intelligence that made criminals uncomfortable and witnesses eager to cooperate. Between them on the tea table lay 4 dolls, confiscated from the families whose daughters were currently fighting for their lives. Each doll was exquisite. Each bore the initials of its intended victim embroidered on the chest, and each, according to Chen's preliminary analysis, had been crafted with substances that had no business being anywhere near children. Chen broke the silence, his voice carrying the faint accent of his Cantonese childhood. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of horror spreading across the faces of everyone present. Thomas stopped pacing. Caroline's response was barely audible, shock rendering her nearly speechless. Morrison leaned forward, his detective's mind already working through implications. Chen picked up one of the dolls, the one intended for Eleanor Harrison, and held it carefully, as if it might detonate. He turned the doll slowly, pointing out details that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. The hair, which appeared to be ordinary human hair treated and styled with expert care, had a faint crystalline residue at the roots visible only under magnification. The fabric of the dress, while appearing to be simple silk, had been treated with something that left barely perceptible staining. Thomas found his voice, though it trembled with barely controlled rage. Morrison consulted his notebook, flipping through pages of interviews and observations. The revelation hit like a physical blow. 4 girls dead the previous year, all following the same pattern, all dismissed as natural causes. The Grayson case had taught authorities about systematic murder disguised as charitable work, but apparently the lesson hadn't been learned thoroughly enough. Caroline's question was the one everyone was thinking. Chen's expression grew even graver. He explained in clinical terms what he'd discovered through careful analysis. The hair had been soaked in solutions containing arsenic compounds, then dried and styled to appear normal. When in constant contact with skin, as would occur when a child slept with a doll, held it close, brushed its hair, the compounds would transfer gradually into the body through absorption and inhalation. The symptoms would mimic various childhood diseases: fever, weakness, respiratory distress, eventual organ failure. The progression was slow enough that no single exposure would cause obvious harm, but cumulative contact over weeks would deliver a fatal dose. Most physicians would diagnose scarlet fever, diphtheria, consumption, or any number of diseases that routinely claimed young lives. The method was diabolical in its subtlety and its exploitation of both parental love and medical limitations. Morrison's question cut to the heart of the matter. Chen's answer was honest and terrifying. The silence that followed was broken by Caroline's barely controlled sob. Her daughter, her only child, might already be beyond saving, poisoned by a gift they'd allowed into their home, killed by their own failure to recognize danger. Thomas moved to his wife's side, his hand finding hers, both of them united in helpless terror. Morrison stood, his decision made. He outlined his plan with the efficiency of someone accustomed to organizing complex operations. The families with sick children would be notified immediately about the source of the illness. The dolls would be removed and destroyed. Dr. Chen would provide treatment protocols for arsenic poisoning, though the effectiveness would depend on how much exposure had already occurred. Most importantly, they needed to find the creator before she could complete this year's collection, or begin planning the next. Chen added his own requirement. The investigation had identified 8 families who received dolls on Valentine's Day, 1847. 4 daughters were already gravely ill. 4 others, including Margaret, showed minimal symptoms, suggesting less exposure or stronger constitutions, or simply luck. Those 4 had a chance at survival if the dolls were removed immediately and treatment begun. Morrison was already moving toward the door when Thomas stopped him with a question that had been building since the pattern was first recognized. The detective's expression was grim. He explained what his investigation had uncovered. The deliveries were made by street children paid a few coins to carry packages to specific addresses. Each child had been approached by a woman in a dark cloak who provided the package, the address, and payment. The woman never used the same child twice, and always chose those too young or too desperate to ask questions or remember details clearly. But Morrison had found one boy, a 12-year-old named Timothy Walsh, who was older and more observant than the others. Timothy remembered the woman's voice, described as cultured and educated. He remembered her hands, which he said were stained with various colors like paint or dye. Most importantly, he remembered her giving instructions in a way that suggested she was accustomed to teaching children. The profile was coming together. An educated woman, probably former governess or teacher with skills in crafts requiring dyes and paints, intelligent enough to plan systematic murders and disciplined enough to execute them over multiple years. Chen added another piece to the puzzle. He'd been investigating doll makers and porcelain craftsmen throughout Boston and surrounding areas, seeking someone with the skills necessary to create such sophisticated work. Most professional doll makers worked for established companies or shops, their output recorded and accounted for. But he'd found references to an independent craftsman, or more likely craftswoman, who had purchased supplies from various sources over the past several years. The purchases were always made with cash, never on credit. The quantities suggested serious production rather than casual hobby work, and the timing of increased purchases correlated with the periods before Valentine's Day in both 1846 and 1847. One supplier, a chemical merchant in Cambridge, remembered the customer more clearly than others. A woman in her 30s, well-spoken, knowledgeable about porcelain techniques. She'd purchased specific compounds used in glazing and finishing, including some that the merchant had thought unusual for decorative work. When pressed for details, the merchant mentioned that the woman had asked particular questions about preservation methods and materials that could be incorporated into porcelain without affecting its appearance. At the time, he'd assumed she was trying to create dolls with enhanced durability. Now, knowing what they knew, those questions took on sinister implications. Morrison's next question was tactical. Chen shook his head, frustration evident. The suppliers had no address, just a woman who appeared, purchased what she needed, and disappeared. She never ordered materials to be delivered, always carried purchases away herself. The pattern suggested someone deliberately avoiding any paper trail that might lead to her location. But Morrison had another angle to pursue. He'd been investigating property records, looking for locations that might serve as a workshop for someone engaged in porcelain crafting. The work required space, ventilation, access to kilns and other equipment. It wasn't something that could be done in a rented room or boarding house without attracting notice. He'd found several possibilities, but one stood out: the abandoned St. Catherine's Orphanage on the outskirts of Boston, purchased in 1843 by a woman named Constance Hartwell. The property records listed her as a former governess, and the purchase had been made with cash. Constance Hartwell. The name meant nothing to anyone present, but it fit the profile perfectly. Educated, experience with children, financial resources to purchase property and supplies, and ownership of a location that would provide perfect isolation for her deadly work. Thomas was already reaching for his coat, but Morrison raised a cautionary hand. He explained his reasoning with the careful logic that had made him successful. If Constance Hartwell was indeed their killer, she'd been operating successfully for at least 3 years, possibly longer. She was intelligent, methodical, and cautious. Approaching her directly might result in her destroying evidence, fleeing to another location, or even taking defensive action that could endanger the investigators. They needed to be certain of what they'd find before moving against her. They needed evidence that would support prosecution, and they needed to ensure she couldn't escape to continue her work elsewhere. Chen suggested an alternative. Morrison considered, then nodded slowly. The plan took shape quickly. Chen would visit the orphanage under the pretense of being a potential buyer interested in purchasing the property. His medical background would make him a plausible prospect, perhaps someone looking to establish a private sanitarium or medical facility. The visit would allow him to observe the location, identify Constance Hartwell if she was present, and potentially gather evidence while maintaining the fiction of innocent inquiry. If he confirmed the location as her workshop and found evidence of doll making or poison preparation, Morrison would move in with sufficient force to ensure arrest and prevent escape or evidence destruction. Thomas interjected with barely controlled impatience. Morrison's answer was blunt. The truth was harsh but undeniable. They were dealing with a murderer who had killed at least 8 children, possibly more. She'd done so with calculated precision over multiple years. Rushing in without adequate preparation could result in her escaping justice, destroying evidence of her crimes, or even claiming more victims before she could be stopped. Chen would visit the orphanage the following morning. If all went as planned, by tomorrow evening Constance Hartwell would be in custody and unable to harm any more children. Caroline asked the question that had been hovering unspoken. Chen's honesty was both cruel and kind. He explained the medical reality. Margaret and the 3 other minimally affected girls had a good chance of full recovery if the dolls were removed immediately and treatment begun. The arsenic exposure had been limited, their young bodies resilient, their symptoms caught early enough to prevent permanent damage. Eleanor Harrison and the two other severely ill girls faced more uncertain prospects. They'd had more exposure, showed more advanced symptoms, suffered more organ damage. Chen would do everything medically possible, but he couldn't promise success. Some might recover partially. Some might suffer permanent effects. Some might not survive despite treatment. The brutal calculus of poisoning was that early intervention made all the difference. And these families had allowed the beautiful deadly dolls into their homes for weeks before recognizing the danger. The meeting concluded with Morrison issuing final instructions. The families would be notified tonight. The dolls would be collected and secured as evidence. Dr. Chen would make his visit to the orphanage at mid-morning, giving Constance Hartwell no reason to be suspicious of an early caller. And they would all pray that tomorrow would bring justice before any more children died. The abandoned saint. Catherine's orphanage sat at the end of a rutted road that wound through sparse woods approximately 5 miles from Boston's center. The building was larger than Dr. Chen had expected. 3 stories of brick and timber that must have housed dozens of children during its operational years. Broken windows on the upper floors testified to its abandonment, but smoke rising from one of the chimneys proved someone was currently in residence. Chen's carriage halted in the circular drive that fronted the main entrance. He'd come alone, as planned, playing the role of a medical professional seeking property for private purchase. His driver would wait with the carriage, ready to depart quickly if circumstances required hasty retreat. The morning was cold, the February sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Chen pulled his coat tighter as he approached the entrance, noting details that might prove important later. The grounds were maintained minimally, paths clear of debris, steps swept clean, but no decorative plantings or aesthetic improvements. Someone lived here but didn't care about appearances. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing in the morning stillness. Footsteps approached from inside, measured and unhurried. The door opened to reveal a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a simple work dress covered by an apron stained with various colors. Her face bore the kind of refined features that suggested good breeding and education, but her eyes held something that made Chen's physician's instincts alert with warning. Those eyes were wrong somehow. Too focused, too intense, watching him with an evaluation that felt predatory rather than curious. Chen maintained his professional demeanor, extending a slight bow. Her response was carefully neutral, voice cultured and controlled. Chen had prepared his story carefully, mixing truth with necessary fiction. He watched her face for reactions, seeing calculation behind the polite mask. She was evaluating him, determining whether he posed a threat or represented an opportunity. The moment stretched as she made her decision. Chen followed her into a hallway that still bore signs of the building's original purpose. Faded paint on the walls showed where religious imagery had once hung. Worn floorboards testified to years of children's feet running through these corridors. But overlaying the orphanage's ghost was evidence of current habitation, a coat hanging on a peg, a lamp on a side table, the smell of a recent meal. Constance led him through the ground floor, maintaining a running commentary about the building's features with the practiced ease of someone who had given this tour before. She pointed out the kitchen, the dining hall, the various rooms that could be converted to medical purposes. Her knowledge of the building was complete, her presentation professional. But Chen noticed other details she didn't mention. A locked door near the kitchen that she passed without comment. A stairway to the basement that she blocked with her body while describing the ground floor's ventilation. The faint chemical smell underlying the ordinary odors of wood smoke and cooking. They climbed to the second floor, where Constance showed him the former dormitories. Large rooms with high ceilings and multiple windows. She described how they could be partitioned into private patient rooms, how the existing plumbing could be expanded, how the location's isolation would benefit patients requiring quiet recovery. Chen played his role, asking appropriate questions about heating systems and water supply and structural soundness. But his physician's trained observation was cataloging other details. The room at the end of the hall with its door firmly closed, The faint sounds coming from behind that door that might have been wind, but might have been something else. The way Constance positioned herself to block his view whenever he moved in that direction. His request was casual, the curiosity of a potential buyer wanting to see all available space. Her refusal was smooth, but absolute. The lie was obvious to anyone paying attention. Chen could see light under the door, suggesting windows that weren't covered. But he didn't press the issue, instead nodding understanding and allowing her to lead him back toward the stairs. As they descended, Chen asked questions designed to establish timeline and confirm identity. Her answer was precise, matching the property records Morrison had discovered. Chen continued his gentle interrogation, disguising it as casual conversation. The response came with slight hesitation, a barely perceptible pause that suggested the question touched on sensitive territory. Chen made a sound of polite sympathy, the kind of acknowledgement that encouraged people to continue speaking without requiring specific response. But Constance didn't elaborate, instead redirecting the conversation to the building's practical features. They returned to the ground floor, where she began discussing pricing and terms with the confidence of someone who had handled property negotiations before. Chen maintained his interested buyer facade while his mind worked through what he'd observed. The locked rooms, the chemical smells, the defensive positioning when he'd tried to see certain areas, all consistent with someone hiding manufacturing operations they didn't want discovered. Combined with her identity as Constance Hartwell and her timeline of residence matching the doll murders, the circumstantial evidence was compelling. But circumstantial evidence wasn't enough for arrest and prosecution. Morrison needed concrete proof. Dolls in various stages of production, poison-making materials, records documenting the murders, all of which were likely behind the doors Constance had so carefully prevented him from opening. Chen made his decision, taking a calculated risk. The request was bold, a potential buyer wanting to ensure proper facilities before committing to purchase. Constance's reaction would tell him much about what she was hiding. Her response confirmed his suspicions. The refusal was absolute, her tone brooking no argument. Chen saw something shift in her eyes, the predatory evaluation returning with increased intensity. She was reassessing him, wondering if his questions were as innocent as they appeared. He needed to retreat before she became openly suspicious. Chen's demurral was smooth, the hesitation of a cautious buyer rather than a suspicious investigator. Constance's relief was visible, though she masked it quickly. She moved toward the door, clearly eager to conclude the visit. But as they crossed the entrance hall, a sound from upstairs stopped them both. A distinct crash, as if something heavy had fallen or been knocked over. Constance's face tightened with an expression Chen couldn't quite read. Anger, fear, calculation. Her explanation was immediate, perhaps too immediate. The lie was transparent. Chen had felt no wind during their tour, and the crash had come from the sealed second-floor room, not from anywhere windows might be broken. But before he could respond, another sound followed the first. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling from somewhere above. The word was desperate, pleading, utterly human. Constance's mask cracked completely. For one moment, Chen saw genuine fear cross her face. Not fear of him, but fear that something she'd worked to conceal was about to be revealed. Her recovery was quick, but not quick enough. Chen had seen the truth in that unguarded moment. There was someone else in the building, someone being kept against their will, someone whose voice Constance didn't want him to hear. Chen made his choice in an instant, abandoning his cautious approach. Constance moved to block his path, but Chen was already running for the stairs. Behind him, he heard her following, her footsteps rapid and her breathing harsh. He reached the second floor and ran toward the closed door at the hallway's end. The sound of movement came from inside, someone shifting position, perhaps trying to call out again. The door was locked. Chen's physician's training included practical knowledge of anatomy and leverage. He stepped back and kicked the door near the lock, using technique rather than raw strength. The wood splintered but held. Behind him, Constance's voice was no longer cultured and controlled, but raw, with desperate fury. He kicked again. The lock tore free from the frame, and the door swung open. What Chen saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was a chapel, or had been once. The stained glass window cast colored light across rows of pews that had been removed to create open space. But the room's religious purpose had been perverted into something nightmarish. Dozens of dolls sat arranged in careful groupings throughout the room, each one exquisitely crafted, each one dressed in elaborate clothing, each one positioned as if engaged in activities, playing, talking, sitting together in eternal frozen companionship. But these weren't display pieces. These were representations, memorials, trophies. And in the center of the arrangement, secured to a chair with rope, was a girl of approximately 10 years old. She was thin, pale, obviously malnourished and terrified. Her dress was torn, her hair matted, her face bruised. But she was alive, conscious, staring at Chen with desperate hope. Chen recognized her from the missing persons reports Morrison had shown him. Sarah Cunningham disappeared 3 weeks ago while walking home from school. The police had assumed kidnapping for ransom, but no demands had ever arrived. Now he understood why. Constance hadn't taken Sarah for money. She'd taken her for her collection. Behind Chen, Constance's voice had changed again, becoming something childlike and pleading. Chen turned slowly, keeping himself between Constance and the imprisoned girl. What he saw in the woman's face was pure madness, rationality completely burned away by obsession and grief. Constance was no longer pretending sanity. The mask had fallen completely, revealing the fractured mind beneath. Her explanation poured out in a rush, words tumbling over each other as she tried to make Chen understand the twisted logic that governed her actions. Rose had been lonely in death, needed friends, deserved companions. These other girls, privileged, wealthy, wasteful of the opportunities they'd been given, were better off joining Rose in eternal childhood. She was protecting them, saving them, giving them the gift of preservation. The dolls around the room weren't just representations. They were the girls themselves, their essences captured in porcelain, their perfection preserved forever. And Sarah wasn't a prisoner. She was the newest addition, being prepared for transformation, soon to join the sisterhood. Chen listened to the madness with a physician's clinical detachment, recognizing the complete psychological break that had transformed grief into delusion. Constance Hartwell truly believed she was performing a service, rescuing children from the corruption of adulthood, creating an eternal community for her lost daughter. The fact that her rescue involved murder and that her community existed only in her fractured mind didn't penetrate the fortress of insanity she'd constructed around her delusions. Chen's voice was gentle, the tone he used with patients who needed careful handling. But Constance was beyond reason. Her hand moved to her apron pocket, emerging with something that glinted in the colored light from the stained glass window. A knife. Small but sharp. A tool for cutting fabric or trimming porcelain edges, now held with clear intention. Chen calculated distances and probabilities. He was closer to Sarah, could possibly free her and escape before Constance could close the distance. But the girl was bound, likely weak from captivity, uncertain to be able to move quickly even if freed. Alternatively, he could attempt to subdue Constance, but she had the advantage of a weapon and the unpredictability of madness. A physical confrontation could result in any of them being injured or killed. Before he could choose, the decision was made for him. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, multiple people moving fast. Morrison's voice, commanding and clear, came from the hallway. Constance's face transformed with an expression of absolute desperation. She'd been discovered, her sanctuary invaded, her collection threatened. The delusion that had sustained her for 5 years was crumbling, and she couldn't allow it to end. She moved toward the dolls with clear intention, not to escape, but to destroy what she'd created rather than let anyone take it from her. Chen lunged forward, crossing the distance between them in 3 running steps. His tackle was clumsy but effective, both of them crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The knife skittered away across the floorboards. Then Morrison and his men were in the room, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Strong hands pulled Chen away from Constance. Other hands secured her wrists with iron manacles. Voices demanded she submit to arrest. Constance didn't fight physically. Instead, she began to scream, a sound of such profound anguish that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. She screamed for Rose, for her collection, for the perfection that was being destroyed by these intruders who couldn't understand the sacred work she'd been doing. The screaming continued as Morrison's men lifted her from the floor and began escorting her from the room. It continued down the stairs, through the entrance hall, out to the police wagon that had followed Chen's carriage. It continued even after the wagon door closed, a faint echo of madness and grief that gradually faded as the vehicle departed. Chen, breathing hard from exertion and shock, moved to where Sarah Cunningham sat bound to the chair. His physician's hands worked at the knots while his voice offered reassurance. The girl nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Chen lifted her carefully, noting signs of malnutrition and abuse, but no immediately life-threatening injuries. She would recover physically, though the psychological scars would take far longer to heal. Morrison stood among the dolls, his notebook already out, his detective's mind cataloging evidence even as his face showed revulsion at what Constance had created. Each doll represented a murdered child, each one crafted with obsessive care, each one positioned in this nightmare tableau of Constance's delusions. He was right. The room was a confession written in porcelain, a record of systematic murder disguised as charitable collection. Every doll provided evidence. Every position in the arrangement told a story. The investigation Morrison had been building just became an open and shut case. Chen carried Sarah toward the stairs, eager to leave this place of madness and death. But at the doorway, he paused, looking back at the rows of dolls bathed in colored light from the stained glass window. Dozens of them. Far more than the confirmed victims from 1846 and 1847. Each one representing a child Constance believed she'd saved. Each one a life ended too soon, a family destroyed, a future erased. The scope of her crimes was even larger than they'd feared. The investigation wouldn't end with today's arrest. It would expand backward through years, connecting these dolls to missing persons cases and unexplained child deaths across multiple states. But that was work for later. Now, Chen needed to get Sarah to safety and medical care, needed to inform the waiting families that the killer had been caught, needed to help Margaret and the other poisoned girls begin their recovery. He descended the stairs carefully, Sarah's weight light in his arms, the winter morning air sharp and clean after the chapel's atmosphere of madness and death. Behind him, Morrison's men began the grim work of documenting Constance Hartwell's collection, counting the dolls, photographing the arrangements, preserving evidence that would ensure she never harmed another child. The Valentine's Day reckoning had come. The killer was caught. The mystery was solved. But the horror of what had been done, the weight of all those small lives ended, would linger far longer than justice could address.